Picture a city of 3 million people powered by 10,000 transformers and humming with a million conversations. Now, picture it all stopping. The power grid collapsing, the streetlights blinking out, every radio station turning to pure dead air. I was sitting in the City Hall command center watching the red dots on the map, our patrol units, turn to nothing one by one. I'd been chasing killers for 12 years, but this wasn't murder. This was an extinction event. And it started with a single 911 call about a man eating his own hand in a diner booth. My name is Jake Kendall, homicide detective. And the worst thing about the end of the world is that the end of the world is always dark. The command center was a desperate, cramped space in the basement of City Hall. Fluorescent lights flickered over tables covered in topographical maps and scattered evidence files. The air was thick with sweat, burnt coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. I stared at the wall of monitors, most displaying dead static. The one still working showed a grainy feed of the street outside, an undulating mass of infected pressed against the armored glass doors. Ryan, a uniformed officer, was frantically working the single remaining satellite phone, his face pale and drawn. "No, sir, you don't understand," he pleaded into the phone. "The containment line failed at the river bridge an hour ago. They're inside the inner cordon. We're talking hundreds. I need those airlifts now before we're overrun." He threw the phone down, shaking his head. "They're denying the reports, Jake. Said we're suffering a mass stress hallucination. They're calling it a level 2 civil unrest." "Let them call it whatever they want," I muttered, checking the magazine of my service pistol. My hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from 18 hours of sheer exhaustion. "We've watched our entire department go dark in 6 hours. This isn't unrest. It's a biological freight train that just jumped the tracks." I needed to know where the one person who understood the science was. "Where's Vance?" "Dr. Vance is in the Emergency Ops Center, EOC. He's trying to stabilize the samples. Said he's close to synthesizing an antiviral." "He's close to getting eaten," I shot back. "That lab is too exposed. We need to fall back to the tunnels, the plans for the municipal flood drains. That's our only viable exit route to the old utility maintenance site." Ryan's eyes widened. "The tunnels? Those plans haven't been updated since '89. They're pitch black and flooded." "Better than this," I said, pointing at the monitor. "The glass is going to hold for maybe 20 minutes, less if they find a car to throw through it. Get the gear, thermal sights, NVGs, and anything that generates heat." The grainy monitor feed outside suddenly shifted. The infected pressing against the glass had stopped clawing randomly. They were still, turning their heads slightly, an eerie, intelligent stillness that set my teeth on edge. "What are they doing?" Ryan whispered. "They look listening." "No, they're smelling the heat," I realized, the horrifying thought chilling me instantly. "They've burned through the visual cortex. They're tracking us by our body temperature. The walls are insulated, but the vents..." The ceiling vent, directly above the map table, rattled violently. Something heavy dropped onto the sheet metal with a muffled thud. The sound was immediately followed by a terrifying, wet hiss that seemed amplified by the metal ductwork, like steam escaping an engine. The vent cover was ripped off, leaving a gaping, jagged hole. A head dropped down. Not a full body, but a neck and head. The skin was gray and mottled, stretched over bulging veins. The eyes were missing, only sunken, bloody holes remained. The nose was a flattened, cartilaginous mess, but the mouth was massive, contorted into a silent, perpetual scream, its jaws straining. I saw the truth right then. They weren't rotting. They were perfected. Every excess sensory input, sight, smell, even taste, had been culled, leaving them with only the raw, burning need for life. Our heat signature. The infected neck stretched unnaturally, reaching down into the center of the room. "Fire in the hole!" I yelled, shoving Ryan out of the way, drawing my Beretta and firing twice, aiming for the spine at the base of the skull. The deafening crack of the weapon was painful in the enclosed space. The head snapped back up with the force of the rounds, spraying a sickening cloud of black-red fluid onto the map table. The movement stopped, but the sound of the shots was immediately answered by a cacophony of hissing from all the vents in the room. They heard the noise, and now they were converging. "They're coming through the ducts! We have to go now!" Ryan shouted. We sprinted down a hallway toward the Emergency Ops Center, EOC, a small, reinforced laboratory a few corridors away. We passed a pile of bodies, two security guards, and a cleaner, all ravaged. Not bitten clean, but torn apart, the flesh stripped away from the bones as if by a crazed animal looking for the warmest meat. They didn't even eat them, Ryan gasped. They don't need food, Ryan. They need fuel. Pure, undiluted heat. We reached the EOC door. I swiped the keycard, which flashed red before the heavy steel door clunked open. Inside, Dr. Vance, the city's chief virologist, looked frantic, covered in sweat, frantically packing vials of blood and tissue culture into a liquid nitrogen cooler. He had a small two-way radio headset secured around his neck. Vance, we're pulling out. The vents are breached. The infected are using thermal hunting. They can smell us. Thermal, no, that's impossible, he argued, his voice high and strained. That requires a neurological leap. It's a simple rabies-like infection. I saw the back of a man's head disappear into a vent shaft. It's thermal, Vance. Now, are you coming or are you going to be the main course? Vance hesitated, looking desperately at the work scattered on his bench. I need the primary data drive. It holds the complete genetic map of the virus and the tunnel schematics. It's the only way to navigate those storm drains. He pointed to a massive military-grade external hard drive locked in a biometric safe. No time. We take the general map. The tunnels are the same as the blueprints. You don't understand, Detective. They sealed the lower levels last year. The schematics show the bypass vents that lead to the old incinerator plant. It's the only way out of the city. Without it, we're lost in a labyrinth. The heavy steel door to the lab suddenly began to rattle violently. The sound was low, heavy, and purposeful, a focused, repeated, blunt impact. That's not a vent job. That's something at the door. Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. A hole was punched through the steel, just above the lock mechanism. It wasn't a jagged tear from claws, but a clean, massive circular puncture, as if made by a pile driver. A flash of gray muscle and a blackened fist smashed through the hole, blindly searching for the heat behind the door. Get the drive! I'll buy you 10 seconds! I yelled. I spun, drawing my spare magazine, and emptied the rest of the clip into the gray fist and forearm. The heavy thud of the rounds impacting thick tissue was sickening. The fist didn't retract, it just twitched violently with each impact, still searching. They don't register pain. The only thing that works is central nervous system disruption. But this thing, it was too strong, too dense. The fist retreated, but immediately the entire reinforced steel door bulged inward with a terrifying, unified, screeching metallic groan. The infected were working together, stacking up their bodies on the other side, using their combined weight and strength to breach the last defense. Jake, we're gonna be crushed, Ryan screamed. The door held for a precious second. Vance retrieved the primary data drive, a compact black slab, and shoved it into his lab coat pocket. Got it! The tunnels. The utility access point is through the maintenance stairwell. Hurry! We raced down a narrow, dusty maintenance stairwell. The steps were concrete, not metal, minimizing the vibration of our footsteps. The air here was thick with moisture and the cold of the earth. Ryan, your sidearm flashlight. Turn it to infrared only. We can't generate any visible light. It just makes us easier to target. We descended into near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, greenish glow of the thermal imaging on our scopes. Through the IR sights, the world was a wash of cool blues and greens. Our own bodies were bright, starkly visible, white-hot beacons of life. The heat we gave off, that was our scent, our death warrant. Every breath, every shift of weight, every single heartbeat was a signal flare screaming, "Come get me." We reached the sublevel, a landing with an ancient, heavily bolted manhole cover in the floor. This was the entrance to the municipal storm drains. Vance, your coat. Take it off. Anything generating noticeable heat needs to be dumped. We need to blend with the cold, damp environment of the tunnels. Dump your gear, now. Vance reluctantly stripped off his coat and dropped his heavy bag. I used a specialized pry bar, struggling to lift the heavy manhole cover. It ground against the concrete, the sound echoing ominously. From the hallway above, we heard the sound of the main EOC door being finally pulled apart. It wasn't a smash, but a horrifying squelch of tearing metal. Then, silence. I checked my IR scope. The entire stairwell above was blue-green. Cold. Nothing visible. I don't see anything, Ryan whispered. That's the problem. They're not using their eyes. I turned the scope down to the floor of the landing we're standing on. I saw thermal footprints, white. The data shows an old ladder well here. Leads to a service crawl space. It's tight, but it should be cold. It bypasses the flooded primary. As he talked, a new sound echoed from the north, the main sewer channel. It wasn't the normal rush of water. It was a rhythmic, scraping shuffle followed by a heavy, wet thud moving along the wall. "They're not supposed to be down here," Ryan hissed, drawing his pistol. "They smell the heat coming off the manhole cover," I said, my voice low and strained. "We can't stay here. Go into the crawl space. Ryan, you cover the rear. No muzzle flash, Ryan. Center mass only if you have to. We need to be surgical." Vance scrambled through a rusted metal hatch that had been hidden behind a sheet of rotting plywood. The crawl space was a dark slit in the concrete. Ryan followed, twisting sideways. I was last, waiting until the scraping sound was dangerously close. I saw the thermal signature of the advancing infected. A long, snaking trail of bright, aggressive white heat slithering along the far wall. They weren't shambling, they were using their limbs to pull themselves along the slick wall, moving with terrifying efficiency. I slid into the crawl space, pulling the metal hatch shut. The scraping sound was now right outside the thin sheet metal. I used the pry bar to wedge the hatch shut. A thick, noxious smell, not sewage, but something chemically acrid, like concentrated ammonia, filled the space. We moved forward in a sickening elbows and knees shuffle. The space was so tight that the thermal heat from our bodies was trapped, creating a white-hot trail as we crawled. "Keep up, detective," Vance rasped from the front. "We need to get to the water line. The water is cold. It's our defense." The tunnel opened into a vast cylindrical pipe, the main flood drain. It was at least 30 feet in diameter, and a freezing cold river of black water rushed along the bottom. We were standing on a narrow, elevated maintenance ledge. The air here was marginally better. Colder. "North to south. We go south," I confirmed, checking my surroundings. As we started moving, my IR scope caught a movement on the opposite side of the pipe. High up, near the curved ceiling where the air was coldest and the concrete was dry, were shapes. They were nearly invisible against the deep blue background. Their thermal signatures were muted, blending with the cold environment. They were so cold they were almost dead. "Stop," I ordered, holding up a flat hand. "Look up. Opposite side." Ryan and Vance raised their scopes. "They're freezing themselves," Ryan breathed, horrified. "They're in a state of thermal hibernation." The infected had found the coldest parts of the tunnels and were waiting, conserving their heat and energy, waiting for a vibrant thermal beacon like us to pass underneath. They were patient. They were smart. They were trap-setting predators. The thought of them being intelligent enough to use the environment this way was far more terrifying than their raw strength. "They're too high. Stick to the wall," I instructed. "We stay low. We stay close to the running water. Let the water siphon off some of our heat." We crept along the narrow ledge, our hearts pounding, generating the exact heat the things above were waiting for. The atmosphere was crushing. Every creaking pipe, every drop of water felt like a shout. We had moved perhaps 200 yards when Vance suddenly stopped dead. He was standing directly under an exposed steam pipe. The bypass is here, but the valve is locked." The locking mechanism was an ancient, rusted wheel. It required massive physical force to turn. The grating sound would be impossible to hide. "We need noise cover," I said, thinking fast. "Ryan, how much C4 did you grab?" "Enough for one breaching charge, maybe 2 small ones." "Not on the pipes, down, into the water." I pointed to the rushing river below. "We need a shockwave. We need to create a large enough distraction to mask the sound of turning that wheel." I lowered a small, waterproof canvas pack filled with debris and rocks toward the water. It landed with a loud splash. From the ceiling above us, the nearest hibernating shape stirred. It peeled itself off the ceiling, its movement unnatural, like a spider descending its thread. It was one of the infected, fully roused, and it was fast. "Ryan, the charge!" I fired my weapon one time, not at the body, but at the old steam pipe above the infected. The bullet punched through the brittle metal, and a searing white cloud of superheated steam burst out. The infected below was instantly enveloped. The pure heat and force of the steam caused the creature to shriek, a sickening, high-pitched whistle, before it dropped into the cold water below with a heavy thud. That single shot, that single scream was our cue. Now Ryan had already attached a small charge to the concrete wall above the waterline and detonated it. The blast was muffled by the water, but the pressure wave was massive. The thunderous echo rumbled and bounced off the cylindrical walls for precious seconds. Vance threw his entire weight onto the rusted wheel, grunting with effort. The wheel screamed in protest, a terrible, tearing sound of metal on metal that was completely masked by the pressure echo. He managed one full rotation. The wheel clunked into a new position. A heavy iron door slid open on the lower section of the wall, revealing a second, smaller tunnel. But the concussion from Ryan's charge had worked too well. It had roused every hibernating infected along the miles of flood drain pipe. Down the main tunnel, both north and south, I saw a horrifying sight through my scope. Dozens of white-hot signatures dropping from the ceiling, hitting the concrete and beginning to charge toward us. They were running on all fours, their limbs twisted and pumping like pistons, moving with a desperate, hungry speed. "Ryan, Vance! Go! Go!" Vance didn't need to be told twice, scrambling through the opening. Ryan fired 2 shots into the advancing wave to buy us a second more. The flashes of heat were blinding in my scope, but the noise was catastrophic. I slid in after them, turning to pull Ryan in. As I did, one of the infected, larger and faster than the rest, reached the opening. Its fist, radiating brilliant, painful white heat, smashed into the heavy iron door, bending the thick metal. I kicked the pry bar into the mechanism, locking the door half closed, but the infected was already forcing its way through the gap. I could smell the stench of its burning metabolism, the pure heat pouring off its body. It shrieked in frustration, its face pressed against the gap, trying to reach me. I smashed my rifle butt against the creature's exposed skull, hoping for the central nervous disruption. The infected didn't even twitch. It was a singular organism, a machine fueled by a single focused objective. I had to create distance. I left the pry bar, firing a final round into the infected's chest mass, not to kill it, but to force the energy of the shot into its central heat generator. It gave a momentary stagger. I took that fraction of a second, pulled Ryan completely into the small tunnel, and threw myself away from the gap. "Which way, Vance?" I gasped, the cold air burning my lungs. Vance was pointing down a narrow, descending branch tunnel. "This way. This takes us to the sewage treatment sublevels. The temperatures there are regulated by the cooling lines. We can hide our signatures." We moved down the pipe. Behind us, the heavy iron door was still shaking violently. The creature was trapped, but still trying to tear its way through. I looked at Ryan. He was breathing heavily, his face slick with sweat. He was holding his arm, which was bleeding from a deep graze where a piece of shrapnel from his own charge had caught him. The blood was a vivid white flare in the IR scope. "Ryan, your arm! We have to bind that. They can smell blood and they can track heat. You just gave them both." We stopped at the junction of the sublevels. The air was colder, thick with a nauseating chemical odor. I helped Ryan tear a strip of cloth from his shirt, trying to bind the wound tightly. "We have to lose the heat," I told him. "We have to cool down. Vance, we need a place to blend in." "The pump room," Vance whispered, pointing to a door nearby. "It's below the water line, surrounded by cold liquid. We can buy an hour in there, but we have to move quietly. This level is riddled with old maintenance access points. They are closer than you think." As if on cue, a faint but distinct scratching sound came from the ceiling of the tunnel ahead. A thin, high-pitched scrape. It was a new sound, a new horror. It was too light to be the massive infected from the main drain. Vance checked his thermal scope and his breath hitched. He pointed down the tunnel toward the source of the sound. "Jake, look at this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're not the big ones. They're children." On the thermal scope, a small, tiny white figure crawled along the ceiling, perfectly inverted, moving with unsettling speed and stillness. Its thermal signature was small, concentrated, and focused entirely on the heat escaping our location. It was the absolute, final, terrifying confirmation. The infection was not selective. It was total. And the smallest of the infected were the quietest, the most terrifyingly effective hunters. "New rule," I said, raising my pistol and switching off the safety. "We don't shoot. We eliminate with silence. We find that pump room, and we pray the cold water masks our final fading heat. The cold of the lower sewage treatment level was a welcome, painful shock. It seeped into my exposed skin, chilling me instantly, but it was a necessary sacrifice. We were descending into the heart of the city's cooling system, where the pipes were lined with liquid nitrogen coolant, and the circulating water was near freezing. The chemical smell was so strong it masked the scent of Ryan's wound, giving us a momentary edge. We moved toward the pump room, a cramped, subterranean space indicated by the schematics on Vance's drive. The only light came from our thermal scopes, and the silence here was absolute, broken only by the slosh of our boots on the wet concrete and the painful, rhythmic thump of my heart. I tried to slow it, consciously lowering my metabolism, trying to appear less vibrant, less appealing to the thermal hunters. "The small ones," Vance whispered, his voice thin with terror. "Their mass is lower, so their thermal signature is tightly concentrated. They're nearly invisible to infrared unless they're moving fast or charging." I knew what he meant. The massive infected from the main line were like blinding heat lamps, but these smaller shapes, the children, were like scalpel tips, quiet, precise, and closer than we thought. We reached the pump room door. It was a thick steel plate secured by a manual turnwheel. "The wheel is too loud," I breathed, drawing my service knife. "We cut the hinge pins. Ryan, your injury. Stay on the door, cover the access point. If they try to force the gap, you stop them with silence. Use the pry bar on the head, not the gun." Ryan nodded, pressing himself against the freezing steel, his breathing shallow. He was fighting his fever, fighting the need to shiver, knowing any heat fluctuation would give us away. I started working on the hinge pins, using the knife edge to clear the rust, then the heavy butt of my pistol as a silent hammer against the blade. Tap, tap, tap. Each infinitesimal sound was agony, amplified 100 times in the cold quiet. Vance held his IR scope steady, tracking the tunnel, watching for any sign of a sudden darting white flare. Finally, the first pin slid free. I reached for the second. "Movement," Vance rasped, his eyes glued to the scope. "Down the line. Fast. It's one of the children. It's tracking Ryan's heartbeat. It's too close to the bend." The small hunter was 30 feet away, running low to the ground. It was moving so fast its thermal signature was flaring, a brilliant, terrifying white streak in the green gloom. I had to stop the pin work. I had to create a distraction without noise. I looked at the vast network of pipes surrounding us, the coolant lines. "Vance," the pipe above the door. "Find the primary junction valve. We need a targeted coolant leak." Vance's fingers flew over the drive. "The valve is here. Manual shutoff. If I turn it, it will cause a controlled pressure release. It won't be silent, but the extreme cold will confuse their thermal tracking. Do it. Time it for when the thing gets to the door." I returned to the final hinge pin, forcing it out. The door now swung inward, free of the frame. I held my breath, waiting. The white streak on Vance's scope was closing the distance. 20 feet. 10. "Now," I hissed. Vance threw his full weight onto the valve wheel. The sound was a loud, tearing grin, followed by a violent hiss as a jet of liquid nitrogen coolant burst from the pipe. It was focused, spraying outward, directly across the access point. The infected child, running full tilt, slammed straight into the freezing gas. It didn't shriek, it didn't pause, but its thermal signature instantly vanished. The super cold liquid extinguished its heat completely, leaving a dark, cold hole in the thermal world. The small body seized up, hitting the ground with a crisp snap, instantly frozen solid. The perfect thermal hunter had been perfectly neutralized by absolute cold. "Inside. Now." We slid the heavy door open, revealing the pump room, a cylindrical vault with massive humming water pumps. The floor was wet, covered in standing frigid water. The air was heavy with humidity and cold. The second we were inside, I slammed the door shut and secured the wheel lock. The sudden, grinding noise of the lock was our second massive sound risk, but it was unavoidable. "We have maybe 5 minutes until that noise draws the big ones back," I said, catching my breath. "Vance, the drive, the incinerator plant, what's the final defense there?" Vance, shivering, plugged the drive into a wall terminal. The schematic flared up. "The incinerator plant isn't the goal. The incinerator plant's steam tunnels are. They run under the old city walls. They are constantly cycling superheated steam. If we can get inside that network, we can use the environment to our advantage." Superheated steam, the opposite of this, I realized, the plan taking shape. We use heat against the thermal hunters. But what about the entrance? The entrance is a heavy blast door, requires a 12-digit cipher and a key card. Vance's voice dropped. The key card is Dr. Vance's. I gave it to the city manager 3 weeks ago. She's at the main police precinct, or was. The realization hit us with the force of a physical blow. The police precinct was overrun hours ago. It was likely a thermal bonfire. We have to go back to the surface, I said, already shaking my head. That's suicide. There is another way, Vance whispered, his eyes widening. The EOC. Before we left City Hall, I was logging the schematics into the city server. I had the drive, but the access code for the blast door was in a temporary data cache on my terminal. I might be able to remotely access the server and pull the code. He was proposing the most insane act of all, reconnecting to the city's dead, infected network. Vance, the network is infected. If you turn on a server, it's a massive power spike, a massive heat source, and a massive noise source. It will attract every thermal hunter in a 3-block radius. It's our only chance, Detective. The incinerator tunnels are the only place we can safely dispose of the virus samples I carry, and the only safe exit. We need that code. I looked at Ryan. He was using his body heat to warm the cloth over his wound, fighting the chill that was trying to claim him. He nodded once grimly. We're already dead, Jake. We just haven't stopped moving yet. I made the call. Fine, we need cover. We need to cool the entire pump room down. I pulled a length of heavy chain from a maintenance hook. Vance, open the secondary drain valve. Flood this place with raw, cold sewage water. We need to drop the ambient temperature 30 degrees. Vance hit the lever. The pump room filled instantly with the deafening roar of rushing water. A black freezing tide began to rise around our ankles, carrying with it the city's waste and the terrible cleansing cold. Ryan, you climb up to that platform, get your thermal signature off the ground. Vance, you get to that console and do your work. Be fast, I'll cover the door. As Ryan climbed, his movement caused his thermal signature to flare, a brilliant white streak against the dark steel. The roar of the water was now so loud I could feel it in my chest. It was the best noise cover we could ask for, a wall of pure sound to confuse the thermal hunters. Vance began working the console, the screen flickering to life. The low hum of the revived electronics was a massive risk, but the sound was immediately drowned by the water. The black, frigid water was up to my knees, slowly sapping my body heat. The IR scope showed my legs turning from white to cool blue, excellent camouflage. Then, from the pump room ceiling, I saw the new threat. The high-pitched scratching sound returned, muffled but unmistakable. The children weren't coming through the main door. They were in the ventilation system, moving silently through the dry air above the freezing water. They were tracking the heat before it reached the floodline. I raised my pistol and sighted on the nearest air duct. Through the grate, I could see 2 small white thermal shapes moving with alarming speed. They were targeting Vance's console, the newest, freshest heat source. Vance, stop! I shouted, the roar of the water swallowing my voice. Vance didn't hear me. He was totally focused on the screen, tapping furiously. I lowered my pistol. The explosion of the shot would bring the entire ceiling down. I had to use silence. I reached for the one thing I had left that could match the cold, my heavy metal pry bar. I climbed onto a low pipe, directly beneath the targeted vent. I waited until the 2 thermal flares were directly above the grate. Then, I drove the pry bar upwards, smashing the thin sheet metal grate with focused, brutal force. The sound was a loud, tearing smash that cut through the water noise. The 2 infected children dropped instantly. They weren't prepared for the cold. They landed in the frigid, rushing water with a sickening plop. The water's cold shock hit them instantly, but the fall didn't stop them. They thrashed wildly in the cold current, their small, desperate hands reaching up, drawn to the brilliant white heat of my body just above the waterline. They were trying to climb my legs. I kicked one away, the frigid water robbing my strength. The other one grabbed my boot, its grip unnaturally strong. I brought the pry bar down again, this time aiming for the top of the creature's skull underwater. The cold water muffled the impact, turning the strike into a deep, heavy thud. The grip on my boot went slack. The small body floated away, inert, into the main drain. Got it! I have the code! Vance screamed over the noise, finally tearing his eyes from the screen. 12 digits. Now we move. Before the breach. But it was already too late. I looked back at the main door. The thick steel plate was bulging. The metal around the turnwheel mechanism was creasing inward, forming a single focused fissure. The massive infected from the main line, the one I had wounded, was back. It was using its incredible strength not to smash, but to compress the door, trying to create enough heat friction to locate the entry point. Exit! Back up the service tunnel! Now! I yelled, scrambling off the pipe, fighting the current of the rising water. The air in the room suddenly grew intensely hot, a wave of sickening thermal energy washing over us. I checked my scope and saw the door turning a brilliant, impossible white. The metal was heating to scorching levels from the concentrated pressure. We raced out of the pump room, fleeing the intense heat, back into the freezing, narrow drain tunnel. Vance and Ryan ahead of me, their thermal profiles blazing from the exertion. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. We heard the final terrible sound. The hydraulic shatter of the massive pump room door giving way, followed by a triumphant, deafening roar that cut through the freezing water and announced that the biggest, smartest, and hottest hunter in the city had found our trail. The massive roar of the breaching infected in the pump room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was pure noise, pure chaos, and for a moment, it drowned out every other chilling frequency in the tunnels. It bought us time. We scrambled down the narrow, descending drain pipe, fueled by a primal burst of adrenaline. Vance, with the precious data drive, was still leading the way in WoW, his lab coat flapping against the cold, wet concrete. Ryan, his wound now a throbbing beacon of heat and pain, was struggling to keep up. "We need a place to hide the heat, Jake," Ryan gasped, his voice ragged. "My arm is on fire." "The steam tunnels," I yelled back, pushing him forward. "Vance, how far to the incinerator complex?" "One final access shaft," Vance shouted, his voice echoing off the curved walls. "The schematics show it as a high-pressure maintenance climb. It should be warm up there." We reached the end of the drain pipe. It emptied into a vertical shaft, maybe 10 feet across, with a rusted, precarious ladder running straight up into the darkness. A faint, cloying smell of ozone and burnt insulation drifted down, a promise of warmth. "Go! Vance, you first! Don't look down!" Vance was already scaling the ladder, his terror of the vertical climb momentarily eclipsed by the greater terror behind us. Ryan followed, his good arm gripping the rungs. I checked the tunnel floor below. The water was receding, and the silence was returning, bringing with it a low, rhythmic thudding that traveled through the bedrock. The massive infected was back on our trail, no longer roaring, but moving with calculated silence, tracking the lingering heat of the frigid water we'd fled. I started my ascent. The ladder rungs felt like ice, but as I climbed higher, the air grew noticeably warmer. By the halfway point, a thick, humid heat wave washed over me, a blessed relief from the cold, but also a catastrophic thermal signal. I looked up through my scope. Ryan and Vance, huddled on the small landing above, were shimmering violently. Two brilliant white flares against the cool background. We were broadcasting our position across the entire quarter of the city. Then I heard the sound I dreaded. The thin, high-pitched scratching of the small hunters. The silence of the ascent had given them the perfect opportunity. They were tracking the rising column of our heat signature, moving through the ventilation network that paralleled the shaft. "Vance! The ladder access door! Force it open! We need to break the heat seal!" I shouted. Ryan and Vance fumbled with a heavily bolted circular access door. The hinges were seized with rust. Below me, the rhythmic thudding stopped. The massive infected was at the base of the shaft. I heard a horrifying sucking sound. It was testing the air, confirming the column of heat rising above it. "He knows we're here!" I screamed, pulling out the last of my useful tools, a few feet of insulated copper wire. "We're cornered!" Vance finally slammed his shoulder into the door. The rust screeched in protest, but the door stayed shut. The ladder below me began to vibrate violently. Not a shake, but a systematic, deliberate climbing. The massive infected was beginning its terrifying ascent. I had seconds. I quickly lashed the copper wire around the metal ladder rung above me, then connected the wire to the main power conduit running parallel to the ladder, a thick humming cable that carried the incinerator complex's high-voltage current. The conduit was dead, but it was connected to the central transformer. "Vance! That data drive. Can you find the power schematic for this shaft? We need 1 second of charge on that conduit. 1 second. Vance immediately dropped to the floor, plugging the drive into a wall panel. The secondary transformer, it feeds this line. I can reroute power from the incinerator's internal generator, but it will be a full 20,000 volts. It will blow the entire line. Do it when I tell you. Ryan, pull the damn ladder up. Break the rungs. Ryan used the pry bar to attack the bolts holding the ladder to the wall. The metal groaned, but held. I gripped the ladder, waiting for the massive hunter below. Through the thick heat and rising steam, I could see its thermal signature rising. A massive, undulating, impossibly intense white supernova climbing right toward me. It was almost within reach. I saw the massive, blackened fingers reaching for the rung just below my boot. Now, Vance! Vance slammed his palm onto the wall panel. The conduit and the ladder instantly flared with brilliant, blinding blue light. A sound like a thunderclap tore through the shaft, followed by the violent, crackling sizzle of superhot plasma. The power surge was catastrophic. The massive infected on the ladder below me seized up. Its thermal signature turned instantly from white-hot to black, a dark, cold void in the heat. The 20,000 volts of electricity had overloaded its hypermetabolism, shutting down its entire neural network and turning it into a dead weight. The ladder was ripped from the wall by the force of the arc and the weight of the massive body. The whole structure, ladder and infected, fell into the darkness with a sound like a collapsing bridge. We had survived the primary threat, but the surge had worked too well. The incinerator complex alarm system now screamed a terrifying mechanical siren, a massive noise beacon broadcasting our location to the entire region. The noise! We're exposed! Ryan screamed, finally wrenching the rusted door open. We scrambled through the opening and into the steam tunnels. Incinerator complex, steam tunnels, continuous thigh. The site was apocalyptic, but it was beautiful. We were in a vast subterranean maze of iron and steel. Giant steam pipes, the size of truck tires, crisscrossed the ceiling and walls, venting superheated steam in continuous, roaring plumes. The air was a scalding, humid cloud. The heat was oppressive, but it was our shield. The steam was so thick it completely obscured our thermal signatures. Through the IR scopes, the entire chamber was a blinding whiteout, the uniform temperature making us invisible. We move. We can hide here, I yelled over the roar of the steam. Vance, the blast door. Where is it? The main boiler room, 50 meters ahead. The heat is intense, but the blast door is directly connected to the main combustion chamber's cipher lock. We ran. The heat was scorching our lungs, but the danger of the infected was greater. The thermal hunters couldn't track us here. They couldn't smell us, and the noise was too disorienting. They would have to rely on sight, and the steam made that impossible. Then Vance screamed. He wasn't looking at the heat. He was looking at the ground. The floor of the steam tunnel, right in the center of the main path, was covered in dark patches. They weren't scorch marks. They were dozens of frozen bodies, zombified children, the small, silent hunters. The blast of super cold coolant from the pump room had traveled through the tunnel network's overflow drains. The children, tracking the cold air, had retreated here only to find themselves trapped in the extreme, scorching heat of the steam. They were now cooked alive, their small bodies blackened and withered, but their terror frozen onto their faces. They're everywhere, Ryan breathed, stepping carefully around a pile of dead children. They came here to wait, and they boiled. We reached the main boiler room. The blast door was a massive, 20-foot sheet of steel, sealed tight. Above it, a small digital panel displayed a flashing "Access denied." The cipher, 12 digits. We need to enter it now, Vance cried, plugging his data drive into the small port beneath the panel. As Vance frantically typed the code, the heavy iron door at the far end of the boiler room, the main maintenance access, began to shake. The infected had followed the sound of the siren and the intense escaping heat. They were here. Dozens of infected, their bodies steaming and dripping from the humidity, began to pile against the door, their combined mass creating a terrifying groan of stressed metal. They were using sheer weight to breach the room. It's overloading. The thermal pressure is too high, Vance yelled, his fingers flying across the keypad. I need 30 seconds. I looked at Ryan. He was weaving on his feet, his fever spiking from the heat. He was a dead man walking. But he had his weapon, and he was still standing. "We buy the time," I said, my voice hoarse. "Ryan, we aim for the eyes. They can't see, but the brainstem is right behind them. Make it count." We aimed at the bulging, tearing maintenance door. The metal was starting to crack. 20 seconds! Vance screamed. The metal door ripped apart. The infected poured into the boiler room. They were disoriented by the steam and the roar of the machinery, but they were still lethal. They moved blindly, shambling toward the brightest source of heat, the glowing pipes and the exposed coolant tanks. They weren't hunting us yet. They were hunting the machinery. We opened fire. 2 focused, tight bursts. 2 infected dropped instantly, their momentum carrying them into the spinning machinery of the pump. 10 seconds. But then 1 infected, taller and more coordinated, spun on its heel. It wasn't shambling toward the pipes. It was looking at us. It was looking at the faint, fluctuating pockets of cold air where our bodies were struggling to breathe in the scorching heat. It didn't shriek. It let out a strange, high-pitched click, the sound of its jaw rapidly snapping open and shut. "It's not tracking heat," Vance cried, recognizing the sound. "It's tracking the sound of breathing. It's adapted to the noise." The clicking spread. Dozens of infected stopped shambling and began to click, a horrifying chorus of snapping jaws, focusing their attack entirely on the small, isolated pocket of sound we were making. 5 seconds! I have the final digit! The clicking infected charged. We were completely exposed. I shoved my pistol into the mouth of the nearest infected, firing blind. Ryan collapsed, his fever finally claiming him, but not before emptying his last round into a creature's chest. "Vance, now!" The digital panel above the blast door flashed green. I grabbed Vance, tearing him away from the console as the clicking infected slammed into the very spot where we had been standing. The massive blast door hissed open, revealing a short, dark corridor beyond. I didn't stop to look at Ryan. I didn't stop to mourn. The only thing that mattered was moving the last remaining piece of the human puzzle, Vance and the data drive, to the other side of that door. I threw Vance through the opening. I slammed my fist onto the control panel, locking the door and sealing ourselves away from the horror. The last sound I heard before the heavy clunk of the blast door sealing was the sound of the clicking horde, consuming the last vestige of heat they could find in the boiler room. I slammed my fist onto the control panel, locking the massive blast door. The heavy clunk of the sealing mechanism was the final, terrifying punctuation mark. We were safe from the clicking, thermal hunting infected, but we were alone. The only sounds were our ragged breathing and the faint, low hiss of a pressure lock equalizing. I turned to Vance. He was leaning against the cold steel of the corridor wall, tears streaking the grime on his face. He held the data drive against his chest like a child. "Ryan," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He's..." I didn't need to answer. I looked at the door, where the rhythmic, furious clicking of the horde had already begun again, focused on the residual heat we had left behind. "He bought us the code, Vance. We finished the job." The corridor was dark and smelled of stale oil and ozone. I checked my IR scope. Our thermal signatures were beginning to stabilize against the ambient cold of the corridor. Vance's data drive had brought us to the final stage, the incinerator plant core. "The core," Vance stated, pushing himself away from the wall. "It's a secure broadcast center. It was designed to send encrypted communication during a citywide power failure. It uses the incinerator's heat to power the antenna array. If we can get inside, we can access the antenna and broadcast the counterfrequency." "Wait, counterfrequency? I thought the drive just had the schematics," I said, suspicion sharpening my focus. Vance shifted uncomfortably. "The drive has the tunnel schematics, the blast door code, and the kill switch data. I wasn't just working on an antiviral detective. I was working on an electromagnetic pulse, a targeted frequency that exploits the hypersensitivity of the infected's neural system. It's a complete system collapse. It stops them instantly. But it needs to be broadcast citywide from a high-power antenna. And the risk? The same risk as the resonance that started this. It's a massive EMP. It will kill every electronic device in the city. Communication will be gone for decades. Everything we rely on will be destroyed. It's a hard reset, but it's the only way to stop them from evolving further." A heavy steel door marked Core Access stood before us. Vance input the final code. The door slid open, revealing a large, circular chamber, incinerator core, continuous. The core was a vast, humming space dominated by a central cylindrical structure that housed the incinerator and its power plant. Control panels lined the perimeter walls. The air was dry and hot, but clean. The antenna access point was a narrow, exposed maintenance ladder leading up to the transmission array above the ceiling. That ladder goes straight up to the antenna, Vance pointed. The console is here. Vance rushed to the main terminal. He jammed the data drive into the port. The terminal roared to life, displaying complex, flashing algorithms. I drew my pistol and scanned the room. It felt too quiet, too clean. I checked the IR scope. The heat from the incinerator was masking everything, a blinding blanket of thermal energy. We couldn't trust our primary sense. I looked at the ground. Near the perimeter walls, where the air was coolest, I saw them. Shadows. They weren't moving and they weren't hot. They were standing perfectly still, using the thermal blanket of the room for camouflage. They were ghost hunters. They were waiting for us to expose our movement, our change in temperature, before they struck. "Vance, stop," I whispered, my voice tight. "We have company. They're using the incinerator's heat to disappear. They're waiting for us to move." Vance froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "I need 1 minute, Jake, to initialize the broadcast sequence. Once it starts, I can't stop it." I had to draw them out. I had to expose their position. But I couldn't use noise. I saw the solution. The incinerator chamber itself. I ran toward the massive insulated doors of the primary combustion chamber. I found a manual pressure valve and began slowly turning it. The valve hissed, releasing a thick burst of frigid compressed oxygen used to cool the burners. The cold oxygen sprayed outward, rapidly hitting the control room's atmosphere. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Where there had been nothing, 3 dark silhouettes instantly appeared on the IR scope. The sudden temperature drop had exposed their latent internal heat. They were standing mere feet away. They were big, infected maintenance workers, armed with crude, sharpened tools. They moved instantly, rushing us. I didn't fire. I smashed the oxygen valve completely open. The frigid gas enveloped the center of the room. The blast of cold sent the infected into a blind frenzy. Their vision was useless, and their thermal sensors were overloaded by the sudden localized cold. They began to thrash, slicing the air with their crude weapons, hitting the control panels and shattering lights. "Go! Run the sequence!" Vance was a blur of movement, his fingers flying across the keys. The central tower began to hum, the high-powered antenna powering up. The infected were dangerously close. I dodged a wild swing from a pipe wrench, the metal blade shrieking as it scraped against the concrete wall. I was relying on pure cold survival instinct, dodging the swinging thermal ghosts. One of the infected slammed its body into the main terminal, attracted by the heat of the electronics. The screen instantly went black. Vance screamed in despair. "He killed the primary screen. The broadcast is running, but the final activation code is displayed only on the terminal. I can't see it. It's a 3-digit override. We need to stop the broadcast without the code." "No, we don't stop it," I yelled, pulling Vance away. "The override is our key." The massive antenna array above began to whine, a low, intense frequency that made the teeth ache. The counter frequency was being loaded. "The final code will be on the main incinerator burner access panel. It's mirrored there," Vance shouted, pointing to a panel on the side of the central incinerator tower, the hottest spot in the room. We raced toward the central tower. The heat was unbearable, but the panel was there, glowing with a terrible intensity. The 3 infected were right behind us, still flailing, their attention torn between the failing terminal and the terrifying rising whine of the antenna. Vance slammed his hand onto the burner access panel. The small digital screen was active, displaying 000 and blinking rapidly. "It's randomizing," Vance screamed, his voice strained by the heat. "I can't stop it. I need to manually input the code." I looked back. The infected were closing in. They were beginning to smell our desperation, our concentrated heat near the core. I knew the ultimate, final move. I pulled Vance off the hot panel. "You don't need the code to stop the broadcast, Vance. You need the code to start the final kill sequence." "What are you doing?" I grabbed the data drive from the panel and threw it onto the main console on the perimeter wall, the terminal the infected had just smashed. It was a pure distraction, drawing the three confused hunters away from the core. As the infected converged on the drive, I took Vance's hand, placing his palm on a specific, unmarked cold steel panel on the incinerator tower. That's the combustion kill switch, Vance whispered, understanding dawning in his eyes. It opens the primary combustion chamber. You found the thermal hunting. You found the counter frequency. Now, you give them the ultimate source of heat. The place where all the city's darkness goes to burn, I said, my voice hoarse. This is our reset. The three infected, drawn to the drive, were now surrounded by the intense cold of the oxygen spray and the insane heat of the core. Their hypermetabolisms were tearing themselves apart. The whining from the antenna reached a fever pitch. The kill sequence was minutes from automatic execution. Push it, Vance, and run! Vance slammed his palm onto the switch. A terrifying hydraulic crack echoed through the chamber. The massive, insulated doors of the primary combustion chamber, the incinerator itself, slid open, revealing a roaring, white-hot, 4,000-degree inferno of fire. The blast of radiant heat was blinding, searing the air. The three confused, thermal-hunting infected, caught between the cold and the heat, turned as one toward the only pure, undiluted heat source left in the world. The fire. The thermal logic was absolute. Go to the heat. With a unified guttural shriek that wasn't rage but pure, absolute need, they threw their bodies directly into the incandescent hellfire. They were vaporized instantly, becoming nothing more than ash and thermal energy. Go! The antenna! The EMP is about to fire! I yelled. We scrambled up the exposed, shaking maintenance ladder to the antenna access hatch. We reached the top, just as the final, agonizing whine from the array reached its crescendo. We were safe inside the shielded broadcast room, huddled against the floor. A silent, impossible blue flash ripped across the city's skyline, visible even through the thick, reinforced glass. It wasn't thunder, it was the electromagnetic pulse. The counter frequency, the kill switch, the whine died. The city lights, the sporadic flashes of emergency generators and remaining street lights, all instantly died. The city was plunged into absolute terminal silence and darkness. The emergency siren that had been screaming moments ago stopped mid-wail. Every screen, every phone, every piece of modern technology was wiped clean. We had won. But the price was civilization. I looked out at the dead city. The darkness was absolute, deep, and final. We had eliminated the infection, but we had traded it for a return to the Stone Age. Vance, huddled next to me, was shaking, clutching the useless data drive. It's done, Jake. It's over. I didn't answer. I reached up, pulling the headset from Vance's neck. I put it on, keying the microphone to the emergency frequency, a final, isolated, low-power analog transmitter used only for extreme deep-sea or space communication. It was the only thing that had survived the pulse. I didn't know if anyone was left alive to hear it. I took a deep breath, the cold, stale air of the antenna room burning my lungs. This is Detective Jake Kendall, I spoke into the mic, my voice flat, tired, and final. City Police, Unit 247. No, Unit 0. The outbreak is contained. Repeat, the outbreak is contained. I paused, listening to the static-filled silence, the new, frightening noise of the world. The rules have changed, I finished. Don't light a fire, don't run a generator. Stay cold, stay quiet, and listen to the silence. They're not gone. They're just waiting for the next sound to wake them up. I dropped the microphone. The transmission was complete. We were the only two warm bodies left in a city of 3 million degrees of cold, sterile silence. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun.